Hello, welcome to the Black Sheep livestream. I am Salome Sibone, and we're going to be talking about the namesake of the Black Sheep livestream, which is the Black Sheep effect. This is something that I discovered and actually inspired me to start this publication called The Black Sheep, because it describes so much of what goes on behind cancel culture and the internet mob mentality we so often see playing out in many different spheres. And so in this live stream, I'm going to discuss the experiment that led to discovering what is now called the black sheep effect. And then we'll also talk a little bit about how we see that play out contemporarily, as well as what it does for you to be aware of the black sheep effect. I've found that understanding this effect is really useful for knowing what's going on when groups are acting crazy and when you should pay attention to these kind of pile-ons, in particular because of who they're attacking and what that might mean about the group and also the thing that they're attacking. Because as we will get into, the black sheep effect is a very unique type of group targeting, where a group targets a specific victim for punishing their transgressions. It's not just all cancel culture. It's a specific subset of what we see in cancel culture and just generally like those kind of pile-ons. And so it's going to be very interesting. And I think it's something that we can use in our lives as individuals, but particularly now that we're largely online, which is a very collectivist form of media. It's all like we're in the village square. So it really brings out the group social dynamics that before the internet were kind of becoming more dormant and secondary, but really are deeply woven into us as a social species. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to describe what is the black sheep effect, because there's a particular experiment that led to the coining of this phrase. And I think it's very interesting, and you will see very quickly how it relates to cancel culture and just a lot of the crazy group dynamics that we see now. So let me read this for you. In 1988, Marquez, Zerbert, and Leyens conducted an experiment where Belgian students rated the following groups according to trait descriptors. For example, sociable, polite, violent, cold. Unlikable Belgian students, unlikable North African students, likable Belgian students, and likable North African students. So these are the four groups that are going to be rated by students according to the trait descriptors that I mentioned, such as sociable, polite, violent, cold. Okay, so the results indicated that favorability is considered highest for likable in-group members and lowest for unlikable in-group members, with the favorability of unlikable and likable out-group members lying in between the two in-group members. So this is already an important finding, because one might assume that the least likable party of this four groups would be the unlikable out-group members. Because of course, who's easier to hate than your unlikable opponents? But this experiment didn't show that. And so that's why it led to coining this phrase, the black sheep effect. Okay, so let me explain more here. These extreme judgments of likable and unlikable, for example, deviant, in-group members, relatively to comparable out-group members, is called the black sheep effect. This effect has been shown in various intergroup contexts and under a variety of conditions in many experiments manipulating likability and norm deviance. So this is what the black sheep effect is all about. It's the fact that when your in-group members, your fellow group members, transgress against your group's norms, you're more likely to find that reprehensible than you would out-group members who transgress against your group's norms. And in some ways that might seem obvious, but in other ways it's particularly interesting because it means that we reserve the harshest treatment for our own people that go against the group. And so you can see how this is such a powerful mechanism for a conformist group enforcing conformity. So there's some more related to this concept, and one of the things that is particularly related to the black sheep effect and understanding it is social identity theory, which is broadly described as the portion of an individual's self-concept, so how you think of yourself, that's derived from your membership within a relevant social group. So that very much could be a political group, a religious group, or some other group, like an ethnic group, that informs who you think you are. And so the reason this ties in with the black sheep effect is because when your in-group members, people of your own group, go against the norms of something that you get your identity from, it threatens your identity. And so in that way, the black sheep in a group is actually more of a threat than the out-group people who transgress against your norms. Because that doesn't threaten who you think you are as a group member. You already conceive of those people who are outside of the group as not part of your group and lesser than because of that. So them transgressing against what you think are good behaviors or good beliefs is not a threat to your identity as a group member. If anything, it's more supportive of that, because you very much see this in people that make a whole personality out of hating the other side, whether it's the right or the left or atheist or religious or whatever it is. People who get a lot of their identity from a group label also get a lot of their identity by differentiating that group from opposing groups. So they can get this sense of self-concept of who they are by being different from others that are not part of their group. So that actually doesn't threaten who they think they are if people that are in a different group don't follow the norms of their group. That fits in perfectly with who they think they are. It's the people who are in their group who don't follow that group's norms who now threaten who they think they are as a group member. Because if you're a leftist and you think being a leftist means doing A, B, and C, and then there's another leftist who starts doing other things that do not follow A, B, and C, now it calls into question what being a leftist is. And if you have a lot of your identity wrapped up in this conception of what it is to be a leftist, then the people who are not going along with that become a major threat to you. And you see this all the time, particularly on the left, but you also see it on the right. Wherever people get a large sense of their identity from their group affiliation, there is more intense vitriol for in-group members who go against that. And so this experiment was from like 1980, and it's a really interesting way to understand group conformity, because now we see a lot of this where people who have this attachment to a group identity are incredibly involved with policing what it means to be that group identity. And you've seen this really destroy political movements like on the left. And I know a lot of people have this conception of, well, leftism isn't supposed to be identity politics. Leftism isn't supposed to be concerned with race and whatever. But the reality is a highly conformist group that values obedience and conformity is going to fall prey to these kind of dynamics where the priority becomes policing if people are obeying the norms of the group rather than actually being functional and doing things that are tangibly beneficial. And so just as a reminder, we are live streaming right now on Instagram, on Twitter, on Rumble, and on YouTube. So if you are on any of those, you can go to the other ones if you prefer them. And you can also leave your comments in all the chats because I will be checking them. And I'm curious if you have noticed the black sheep effect in your own life, because it's not just something that happens with these broad groups, right? Like political identity or religious identity. What I've also come to notice is that the concept of the black sheep as someone who differs from the norms of a group transcends just those particular groups. I think it also plays out in the family and in smaller social spheres. So what I've noticed is that people who want to do things in a different way while being part of a group, so they may be part of their family, but dislike how their family all yells at each other when there's any kind of disagreement. That person who wants to do things differently becomes a source of antagonism and a threat to the people who are wrapped up in doing the things the way they want to do them and who don't want to feel like they're doing things badly. And so this is part of what is a challenge if you are a black sheep. It's because by the nature of trying to do things in a different way and trying to do things better, you hold a mirror up to other people who are not doing those things. And so that becomes a source of contention for people where you'll get things like, oh, do you think you're better than us? Or you think that you're so different. These kind of phrases that are meant to diminish someone simply for trying to go their own way. And it really comes from a place of defensiveness on the part of the people who are doing that, because the reality is they probably know on some deep level that the way they're doing things is not as good as it could be. And so when someone shows them that by choosing to go a different path, choosing to say, no, let's actually have a discussion instead of just yelling and shutting down the discussion because people don't agree. No, let's actually try to do something different and tell each other how we feel about this problem instead of just stonewalling and like not saying anything and being super repressed and growing resentment because we don't talk about the things that are upsetting us as a family. So like you'll have these kind of gestures of trying to do something different, and oftentimes the people that are trying to do that, they're the black sheep in their family. They're trying to do things in a better way, and that's going to be likely seen as a threat to the people who are not prepared to do things differently and potentially don't even want to consider the fact that there may be better ways to be than they are being, because that comes with it a sense of maybe I'm not good enough. Have I been doing things wrong all this time? I don't think I can do things better. And this sense of inadequacy. And so rather than confront that and do that hard work, people lash out at the one that is making them feel that. That's the black sheep. The person that gets scapegoated as the problem when really what they're doing is simply revealing the fact that there is a problem and making it difficult for people to pretend that that's not the case. So you have things like this, right? Where I see this black sheep effect playing out in dynamics and group situations that are not what we would think of as like a typical group situation, like what the experiment describes, where it's people that are attached to a national identity, like being Belgian or North African, which is what they use in the experiment. And so let me know if you have had this experience of being a black sheep because I think it's something that in some sense everybody feels to a certain degree, whether it's just in a particular setting or like a one-off instance, or whether it's in more of a lifelong path situation where you usually are the person that's like marching to the beat of a different drum and you've been aware of the fact that you are marching to a different drum and it's been a source of contention. And what I have found so useful about understanding the black sheep effect is that, like many things, once we put a name to it, you can better conceptualize what's going on, as opposed to just feeling like, why is everybody freaking out? Why do people get mad at me when I want to have a serious conversation about something instead of just nodding along and pretending I don't have anything different to say than them? Why do people lash out at me when I say, hey, I think there could be a better way of doing this? When you have this conception, this concept of the black sheep, it gives you a map for realizing, oh, this is what's going on here. This is a very normal dynamic, actually, and I'm simply the person who's playing this role, and there's nothing wrong with this role. On the contrary, this is a necessary and beneficial role. So rather than lament that I'm in this situation and feel like maybe there's something that I'm doing wrong, why haven't I found my place where I don't feel like this, where I don't feel like everybody's at odds with me, rather than being in that headspace, understanding the idea behind the black sheep effect gives you this ability to say, no, actually, this is necessary and I'm playing an important role. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary and important. That is what I found for me, and it was just so much more helpful when I finally realized that there are just some people who don't quite go along with the group in lockstep. And it's not that they're condemned to some miserable life of not getting it like everybody else does, but rather they're the percent within a group that is designed to bring in variation, is designed to prevent the stagnation of a group. But what I've also realized from studying the black sheep effect is that when you have groups that are too conformist, that are too rigid, they don't tolerate those black sheep. They do everything in their power to push those black sheep out of their group. Because remember, the black sheep effect involves someone who is within the group being demonized for differing from the group. And so what a rigid conformist group will do is try to take that black sheep and push them out of the group and say, actually, you're not part of the group. Because anybody that disagrees with the group isn't part of the group anymore. And so it's this self-policing mechanism by which groups who are only primarily seeking obedient and conformist members keep shifting the goalposts so that as soon as you question, as soon as you step out of line, you're no longer in the group. And you see this happen a lot on the left. This is what led me to be aware of this dynamic, because it was just so clear there was something really wrong with the group dynamics among leftists. There was such a disingenuous attempt to like cut people out if they didn't toe the line on each new issue too. Like, it's crazy because you have some of the trans ideology issues, like men can get pregnant, where it's like this weird little rhetorical game where you're just supposed to say, yeah, that's what I've always thought. That's exactly how I say it. That's what I've always thought. What's new? That's not new. When it's like, I'm sorry, but I have a memory, and I remember being in Occupy Wall Street, like going to those protests, being a leftist, and ain't a single soul was talking about men can get pregnant. That was not a thing. It was not a thing. But now, as soon as it becomes a thing, you're supposed to act like it was always a thing, and don't you dare ask a question about it, because of course it's always been a thing. It's obviously correct, right? Why would you question it? And if you do, well, you're a fascist, hateful, transphobe, bigot. You're not part of our group anymore. You're out. We're going to mistreat you. And so that is the dynamic that you see in really unhealthy groups. So that's the kind of collectivist mindset where there is no respect for individual variation within the group. That's what I describe as a community. A community is a group that tolerates, even hopefully appreciates its black sheep. So you could see something like this, like a healthy family, or like the ideal of a university also, right? Where you'll have within a department, like maybe it's the psychology department at a university. Not every professor in the psychology department at a university is supposed to all be on the same page and all agree with each other. That's not the point of scholarship. In these kind of situations where you have community, where you have a healthy family, where you have a healthy academic department, there's variation. There's people that are like totally at odds with the predominant idea. They march to the beat of their own drum, but they're still treated as useful. They're still treated as valuable members of the group, even if that one's kind of annoying because they always go off on that rant about that thing. But it is interesting that they have this insight into a different perspective on this issue. Or within a family, it's like, little Johnny, he never wants to do the social activities. He never likes doing the family social stuff or going to the birthdays or the events. But he's so smart and he's always reading and he's always showing us these cool little facts, and we appreciate that. That is a group dynamic by which you can have that variation between individuals, where there's appreciation and tolerance for the people that don't go quite along with the group. It's absolutely possible. So what I have learned from studying the black sheep effect is that it's a really great canary in the coal mine situation for recognizing which groups are healthy and which groups are not. And Steph left a comment here that I love. They're not about community, they're about cult. It's fucking terrifying. 100%. And it sounds hyperbolic to talk about like, it's a cult, because like I feel like that word gets thrown around so much now, but it gets thrown around for a reason, which is we're starting to recognize these dynamics by which you can't question the dogma. The people who do question the dogma are treated as nasty, hateful, dangerous outsiders. And everybody acts as if you must be in lockstep within the group, or you're simply lesser. You're not as good. That's not healthy. Those are cult dynamics. It might not have like a faith claim about like, the earth is going to end in 10 years or something, but it's the same kind of pressure to conform and to remain obedient above all. And that's really the thing that once I started opening my eyes to these group dynamics, the alarm bell started going off. I realized how little respect there was for individuality and for the individual in a group. And that's what's so fascinating about understanding the black sheep effect and this experiment that they ran, where they found that no, actually, it wasn't the unlikable outgroup members that were rated the lowest by the people tested. It was the unlikable in-group members. Those were the people in that original experiment that coined the black sheep effect phrase. Those were the people that were treated the most harshly. It was the people of your own group who were differing from the group's norms. And there's just so many implications about what that means for us today as we increasingly identify with group labels, right? Like you have this time where people put flags in their bios, people put all these like political labels like feminist, libertarian, trans rights activist, whatever, all these different labels that really signify I'm part of this group. And so as we become so much more attached to group labels, which I very much believe comes from this social media environment where you actually can't get to know individuals as much as you could in person. So what do we do instead? We rely on these shorthand markers of who a person is, which is, well, I see the flags in your bio, I see the labels that you've chosen to attach yourself to, and I read one of your tweets where you said that you liked one of Trump's policies. Okay, so you're a Trumper, you're a Nazi, you're a fascist, whatever, you're a white supremacist. Like, we just jump to the biggest conclusion about this individual is part of that group, even though you've never met that individual. And the reality is that so often when we talk to people, they might say, yeah, I voted for Harris. Yeah, I voted for Trump. But in conversation, you find out how different one Harris voter is from another, and the same for Trump. But in this environment where we're so much more prone to view people as avatars of a group, we don't grant that individuality. And so I think it's so much more important to be aware of group dynamics like the black sheep effect. And so I want to get into why I find that so valuable also, not just for this time where we're super groupish in our social media lives and in our media lives broadly, but individually, because I have found that being aware of this dynamic by which people are more likely to show hatred towards their own group members who challenge the group's norms versus out-group members who challenge the group's norms, that you can understand what you should pay attention to a little more. Because it's not so much just that, oh, I know that this group isn't a healthy group, that this group is primarily interested in obedience and conformity because of how they're treating their in-group dissenters, but you also know what they might not want you to know. And that's one of the most valuable aspects of the black sheep effect, is reverse engineering what that unhealthy group is doing. So if you have an unhealthy group that attacks its own members for bringing up certain questions, the thing that you should look at is those questions. Those questions are probably going to be some of the more pressing and important things that that group is not dealing with, hence why they are mistreating the dissenters that bring it up. And so I've found that keeping that in mind, where it's like, okay, so I see who's getting attacked. Now, wait a minute. I know what that says about the group. Well, but what does that say about what they're attacking? What can I suss out that they don't want brought up based on what they are trying to suppress? And so that's kind of like reverse engineering the black sheep effect. And you see this all the time because it is not specific to the left. It's specific to groups that are attached to like nationalist identities, to ethnic identities, to sex-based identities like feminism, like the manosphere movement, to religious identities. These groups are some of the most defensive kind of groups because they're primarily focused with self-preservation. Like, yeah, I know that at one point we had first wave feminism, which I think was good overall because it was not so much a feminist movement as it was a movement focused on specific goals. And those goals were often in line with creating a classical liberal society where everybody had the right to vote and there was equal treatment under the law. I believe in that. That's not the same as contemporary feminism now, which asserts the idea that sex differences are primarily social conditioning, and we can simply uncondition those sex differences. And why aren't women all loggers? Probably because of sexism. This is the kind of like rhetoric that's unbound from reality that doesn't actually even have very tangible goals because it's largely based in this kind of academic critical theory practice by which the point is to simply theorize forever about how things are all inherently tied to misogyny, not actually, let's get this policy passed. Let's reform this issue. Let's raise awareness about this particular problem. That's the kind of activism that we have largely lost today, as activism has instead become a replacement for a sense of identity, a moral outlook on the world. Instead, we just virtue signal by using activism to tell people what kind of person we are, which ties back to that aspect of the black sheep effect that I discussed in the beginning, which was social identity theory. The fact that we get our sense of self, our self-concept, largely sometimes from the groups that we are a part of. And so if you are the kind of person who gets a lot of your sense of self, who you are, by the groups that you identify with, if someone challenges that group, they are challenging you. They are challenging your identity. And so you are that much less likely to actually contend with that challenge because it's such a threat to who you think you are. So let me answer one of the questions here from Lily. Hey, Lily. How do you feel we can create common ground amongst the divided spaces we are dealing with? Whew, that is a great question. Well, I kind of think it's not going to happen online for a while because I feel like the online sphere, unfortunately, is in some ways inherently designed to be echo chambers. And we constantly see that, right? Like the content that you engage with leads you to get shown more of that content. And soon you're just in this bubble of content that is all what you want to see and none of the things that contradict that. And so we don't actually have as many opportunities online to have genuine across the aisle types of engagement where we can find common ground because we're siloed into different subgroups in social media where we don't actually come into contact in ways that allow for productive common ground seeking. So I find that it's hard to do that. But honestly, for me, what it is a personal practice. It is something that I lead with as a conversational strategy. And so this is the hardest answer. Unfortunately, it's just something that we have to lead with. And I think that's so hard. So I give anybody who even tries to do that, anybody who like you, who even thinks to ask this question, to even care about this, so much credit. Because honestly, that's already further ahead than so many of us are, because we're in this system, this entire ecosystem where not just the legacy media, but social media, these different forms of media are all pushing us towards division rather than seeking common ground. And what's really scary is I think that we've even lost the value of common ground. I don't see a lot of people online, at least, who even assert that seeking common ground is valuable. So perhaps the answer is, let's start with amplifying the fact that seeking common ground is valuable, which sounds like so sad and depressing that we have to start there. But that is so often the case with many of our problems. It's that we build these worldviews based on fundamentally flawed premises. And then we just keep constructing them further and further. So we're arguing up here after we've built a mountain on top of a fundamentally broken premise. And we're trying to talk about how the tip of the mountain is malformed, when in reality, none of that matters, because you can't even address the mountain until you get to the fundamentally flawed foundation that it's built on. And so I have found that discussing my appreciation for, just sharing knowledge around things like seeking common ground, things like the principle of free speech, things like what is the philosophy of classical liberalism, rather than like, let me tell you why you're wrong, which is the mode that most of social media sets us up to engage with, because we're presented with like, here's this thing, here's this opinion, react to it. And so then we just come in and say like, no, this is wrong because da da da. When in reality, we got to go way, way back to square one so often and just say like, here's the fundamental principle that is free speech. Here's why this actually matters. It's because free speech is not perfect, but it's better than censored speech, because who's going to have the power to censor? So if you are concerned with uplifting the oppressed and having a equal society and preventing unfairness, you need to accept the imperfect application of the free speech principle, because yes, it's imperfect, but it's much more likely to give someone a chance at equality than a system where censorship happens, which in the wrong hands absolutely will not lead to anything nearing equality. And so it's like that fundamental principle right there, right? Like that explanation that I just gave is something that I didn't know for a long time. And so I had built this flawed worldview on a fundamentally flawed principle of a premise of what I thought free speech was. I didn't know what free speech was. And yet I just started building a worldview based on free speech is bad because it allows people to say mean, hurtful things, and we should stop that. And so you could argue with me there and say, well, no, free speech doesn't allow people to say just anything. And the point of letting people say more than less is because that way we can combat bad speech with good speech and whatever. I wasn't there yet. I actually had to go way back and understand, okay, so you care about people having equality. You care about a compassionate society. Well, how do you deal with the fact that censorship is a form of power? And the ability to censor leads to inequality. So which do you prefer? The inequality of a natural system by which people choose to say different things and lead different lives, but all have the capacity to engage in free speech? Or an unequal system by which people obtain the power to censor others and then enforce an unequal setting? So if I had gone back and reassessed that fundamental premise, it would have made a lot more sense to me than like arguing way down the line where I had already built this like really convoluted worldview around free speech is dangerous because it hurts people, and like censorship can be good because it gets rid of like dangerous speech and blah, blah, blah. And so to answer your question about how we can create common ground amongst the divided spaces we're dealing with, I think that rather than fight with people or argue with people or even just like get into that debating mode, even though there can be utility in that, I think that we can do a lot by just elaborating on why we believe what we believe, why we value what we value. So that would be, what is actually good about seeking common ground, right? And it sounds crazy to be in a society where we have to argue for the virtues of seeking common ground, but nobody's done it. Did you go through school and really have that specific discussion taught? Because I didn't. I think a lot of these things we've, as a culture, assumed that they would just be embedded forever in us, and that's not how ideals work, especially the ideals of a classical liberal society, which in so many ways are meant to restrain our more primitive, our more mob mentality tendencies. And so the natural state of a human being is a more authoritarian, conformist, force-using type of person. So we have to do this intentional extra work to teach that there is a better way than what feels like it's useful, what feels like a natural way to do things. Because if not, we're just going to have to learn everything the hard way all over again, which I don't know, very much seems like we are on the precipice of having to do in some regard. But that is my long answer for how we create common ground amongst the divided spaces we're dealing with. I think it starts with the most fundamental practice of just like elucidating why we value seeking common ground and practicing the act of seeking common ground, like actually doing it ourselves and making it such a conscious and intentional and routine practice that we really live what we preach. And on top of that, what I have found is useful for trying to be that kind of like common ground builder is to not do what is so easy to do on social media, which is just fall into like, I'm going to dunk on the people that I disagree with as my mode of engaging with ideas I disagree with. And, that's in some ways the opposite of seeking common ground, is just saying like, oh, these people suck, they're wrong because of this, that, and the other. And it's like, what if we started our responses to the things that we think are wrong with the common ground part, with the part like, I know why these people think that free speech is unfair and harmful, because they care for an equal society. They think that they're pursuing equality by trying to remove things that hurt others or put others at a disadvantage. And yet they've got these fundamental premises that are incorrect. And so in seeking the same goal of a society where people have equal treatment under the law, I choose to have a society with free speech. And so you just like explain that by starting at the point of what's the common ground. And in a way, it's kind of like a fun practice to put yourself through. Like, it's a good challenge to say, okay, I know that these people are wrong, and I know that I find their being wrong annoying, but what is it that they are pursuing that I can actually understand and empathize with? Yes, they're pursuing it wrong, but what do they think they're pursuing? Because that's where the common ground is. Like, there's so many situations where we actually are seeking the same goals, but we are seeking them in different ways. And so I was criticizing this person that was posting online about like healthcare is a human right and it's disgusting or offensive that anybody should ever have to pay for healthcare. And I was just like, oh gosh, that's so wrong. That's so wrong, not just economically, because the idea that like nobody should have to pay for healthcare just doesn't exist, because even in a socialized system, you're paying for it through your taxes. So it's a weird kind of like emotional slogan that just doesn't even convey the accuracy of what that system requires, which is you're still going to pay for it. You just think it should be forcibly paid for through taxes and then redistributed to a government-run healthcare system. Like, that's still paid for. So like, why are we even using the slogan that doesn't convey the accurate reality of this system? Like, you do think people should have to pay for healthcare. So it's like this sloganeering. And it was just, to me, it was like, oh, it's so bad though, because you get into these slogans where it's like healthcare is a human right, as if this is a magic spell that just removes the fact that scarcity is a thing. Like, you can't just declare something a right and have it appear in abundance cheaply for everyone forever, always, at all times. Like, it's not magic. It doesn't work like that. Resources are still scarce. Time is still scarce. There's still going to be a limiting principle, whether it's the cost of something or the availability of something, because you're in a system that's rationing it instead. So you have 10-hour waiting room times instead of expensive healthcare, some kind of other system like that. So no perfect system in that way. But like, nonetheless, I still saw that this person was seeking what I ultimately agree with, which is I too want people to have the healthcare that they need. So I can agree with the socialist who, despite me believing that their system leads to worse healthcare outcomes, where people are not getting the healthcare they need on time because they're having to wait for it so long because it's rationed, or because the system doesn't produce as successful healthcare because there's no incentives to improve the healthcare system. Nonetheless, we're still ultimately pursuing the same goal, which is better, more available healthcare. So it's like, okay, let's start there. Let's remind each other that we actually are on the same side in terms of what we're pursuing. I think that's so underrated, that you can start out a disagreement by saying, hey, by the way, let's just both recognize that we actually want the same good outcome. Despite me not believing that socialized healthcare works well, it's not because I hate people and want them to die of preventable illnesses. Like, that's not my motivation. And despite the fact that I think your appreciation for socialized healthcare is economically illiterate and foolish, it's not because I think you want people to die and that you're an evil person. I simply think that you don't understand what works best because you're not taking into consideration things like economics and scarcity. And so if you start there, that's the kind of common ground building that I think is really underrated, because it seems obvious, like, oh, obviously I don't want that. Obviously they don't want that. But that's not how we think of it in our heads. Like, very often people let themselves believe that the person they disagree with is like either just an absolute idiot or is a deeply hateful, nasty bigot. And this allows them to be lazy in their reasoning and say like, oh, you're just stupid, or oh, you just hate people. And it's like, no, I have good reasons and I have the same good motivations you do. I just have different reasons. So that's my tangent on seeking common ground. So let's get back to the black sheep effect. To recap for people, I want to discuss the experiment that led to the black sheep effect. And so basically what was done was a system where people were able to rate who do they like least. And the people that they liked least wasn't out-group members who don't follow their beliefs. It was in-group members who aren't following their beliefs. That's the black sheep effect. And so what I think is really interesting about this isn't just what it tells you about a group, because when you see a group that is demonizing its in-group members for transgressing on its norms, its beliefs, you have a group that does not respect that kind of individual variation. And so you know that this is the kind of group that will harm its own members if they get in the way of keeping the dogma as it is. And so that is a dangerous, unhealthy group. But what I've also noticed is that you can use the black sheep effect to think about things in your own life in a way that intentionally seeks out what is not obvious, what is the minority or the dissenting view on something. So let me think if I can come up with an example. I'm never good at coming up with like random examples on the spot. Okay, but like for instance, imagine you're in some kind of like meeting at your job. Then everybody's like, yeah, I think the reason we're having this problem is because of this. We're all pretty in agreement that this is the problem. Normal human psychology leads us to want to agree with the group. There's another experiment on this. I can't remember what it's called. I can't remember. I'm not gonna try to remember it because I'm gonna mess it up. I'll just describe it. So the experiment was one where everybody in the room was an actor except for one person, which was the actual like experiment participant. And the experiment was set up so that all the actors in this room are going to give the same answer when they assess the length of a string that's placed up on the wall in front of them. So they have to give this answer and say, how long do they think the string is? And so all of the actors are set to give the same incorrect answer to how long the string is. And it's a crazy experiment because you'll look at pictures of it and like the picture, they hold the picture of like, this is how long we think the string is. And the string is like right there. And they're holding this picture that shows how long the string is. And it's just so obviously not the same string. And yet everybody else except that one experiment participant is in agreement that that long string is actually short. And what is incredible about this experiment is that I believe it's more than half of the people that participate in this experiment, when they are put into a situation where everybody in the group says that long string is actually a short string, even though you can see it with your eyes, these people are looking at the string right in front of them, they will defer to the group and give the wrong answer. Just because, presumably, they don't want to be the black sheep. They don't want to be the only person in the group who gives the wrong answer. And it's such a fascinating insight into human psychology because it really emphasizes how much we are designed to go along with the group and to not draw this kind of like isolating attention by which we're the only ones who are not in sync with the group. And the problem is that this has so many implications for bad things because sometimes there is the one person who has a unique insight into why everybody else is wrong about something. And if that person gets cowed into giving the wrong answer just for the sake of conforming to the group, it can be fatal. It can be a seriously destructive situation when a person chooses conformity instead of truth simply because they're uncomfortable being in that black sheep position. And so this is why a concept like the black sheep effect is so important, because it gives you this awareness of our predisposition as human beings to choose conformity over truth. And as we are now in a modern society where we are all connected in these massive groups that aren't really groups because we cannot talk to a gajillion people online, but they can talk at us when we post something. So we feel like we're in a group, but it's not actually a genuine group because you can't have a coherent, productive back and forth with the whole online world. And yet it still triggers these social proclivities as if we are in a group, like trying to conform, like trying to avoid drawing negative attention from the group. And so it's really unfortunate because what ends up happening is that we rob humanity, we rob ourselves, we rob our community of what could be really good, truth, progress, innovation, whatever it is that we have insight into, if we choose instead to just go along to get along because we give in to that social pressure to not be the black sheep. And so what I've found is that being aware of this gives you that extra chance to not get cowed by that pressure. And yeah, like this comment says, the primal fear of being excluded by the tribe. I think in some ways we really underestimate how real that is because we're not running around a tribe, and we know that we're not going to get executed by someone randomly in our tribe because we're doing things so differently. Except that is what would happen in tribal times. You would, I believe it's like research with chimps. No, I think it's actually not just chimps. I think it's chimps that will do this. I think they will attack and try to kill a leader that becomes too dominant. I think I'm twisting that a little bit, but basically the idea is chimps are sensitive to their leadership And they will turn on their own leaders if they feel that those leaders are like too overbearing or like too dominant or something, or too aggressive, I think is the thing. And similarly, humans would do the same thing. I believe that there's either anthropological records of this, or somehow there's been some kind of like research to uncover these dynamics, but that in these kind of like really older primal tribal societies, groups would have these situations play out where if there was a group member who was either being very greedy, I believe is one of the things, but for sure being like really aggressive. Like if there was a group member who was causing a lot of like trouble and dysfunction and like being highly aggressive and fighting with others and whatever, and just kind of like being unhinged, that their own group would gang up on them and kill them. And in some ways it's like, yeah, duh, that seems not actually that novel, that you would kill someone who was like threatening the security and the survival of your group because there's something wrong with them probably. And it's a very normal like group culling dynamic. I believe there are, it's the same kind of principle perhaps with animals where they sense weakness in their own animal group and they will take out their own from their own herd, their own group, if they sense that that member is so weak that they're likely to draw the attention of predators or perhaps spread some illness to the group. Like they'll turn on their own for the sake of preserving the group. So that is in us. That is part of what it means to be a human being. You gotta imagine that like psychology is so deeply still within us that we sense if I disagree with the group, they might kill me. And logically we know that's crazy because that's just not how it goes. But our animal brain does not know that at all, because our animal brain is not logical and does not reason in that way. And so when you have that kind of experiment that I described, where everybody in the experiment gives the wrong answer, the obviously wrong answer, and you have that one experiment participant who looks around and is like, everybody's giving the wrong answer, I'm going to give the wrong answer too, even though they know, because you can just look and see that that's the wrong answer, they still go along with what's wrong, probably because in our animal brain, that's that feeling of like, am I in danger of drawing the kind of negative attention from the group that could lead to me being exterminated from the group, then I'm not going to do that. And so it's safer to just go along than to draw that negative attention that in our history could have led to us being killed by our own tribe. So it's an amazing thing, but it's something that we have to be aware of. And so part of why I love the black sheep effect and this kind of like collective psychology is that it gives you that awareness. It gives you like a framework to look at things in this otherwise like very different modern world through that lens that we are evolved to relate to things through, which is like group dynamics. And so what I've found is like, you can practice that, right? So instead of being the person in that experiment who succumbs to the pressure to go along with the group for the sake of not drawing that negative attention and standing out, if you know that that is a thing that happens to you as a human being, you can draw awareness to the fact everybody's agreeing right now. Ding, ding, ding. This might be the exact time when a different perspective is most useful, rather than simply one other yes man in the room. And so, you have to be aware of your own situation and think about like when that's appropriate and when it's, you don't do it just pathologically for the sake of it. But there are many situations where it's like, you can teach yourself to cue that kind of a thought process that's akin to what's missing. I see that everybody's in alignment with this. I see that everybody's looking at this and coming to the same conclusion. What's not being looked at? What's a different conclusion that I could come to that's not what everybody's seeing here. And so it's this intentional effort to look for what is not being discovered, to think about what is not being analyzed. And that's what I get from the black sheep effect and try to apply to my life as an individual. And I think it's also really useful to apply to your work potentially. You can imagine like someone who's in medicine or in law and of course in art or very much in business, using this thought process inspired by the black sheep effect, which is, okay, I see how all these businesses are doing things. What's not getting done and why? That is not even that novel. Like, that's actually a very normal way to identify market gaps that you can solve with a business. And it's amazing because it very much fits in with the black sheep thought, which is what's not getting done? What's the thing that's missing here? What's the minority position? So I really find that a useful thing to have in mind as a counterbalance to our natural proclivity for conformity. And so I will give you some of my personal experience with the black sheep effect as someone who very much went through a conformist phase. When I was younger, and I was first starting to come to consciousness politically, of course, I was so cursed as to do that on tumblr.com, where all of the craziness really started brewing. Drop me a note if you are from the Tumblr era, if you are one of the people who remember Tumblr, for better or for worse. But that is where I first started encountering politics and like political commentary. And it was just so obvious to me that like, oh wow, everybody hates conservatives. Like everybody on here does not like people who lean at all to the right. Like it is the further left you are, the better. And so I was very unaware of all these kind of like social dynamics at the time. And I didn't realize how much they ruled me as well. I was just like a 20-year-old trying to figure out like, who am I? What do I believe? How do I get the things that I think I want in this life? And also navigating this like new weird online world. And so I'm here trying to be cool, trying to post on Tumblr and do my little thing, trying to have my art career. And I see the beginnings of cancel culture also, where people intentionally go after people that don't think the same way that they do politically and try to ruin their lives, try to attack them as a person. And I remember very much being deeply uncomfortable and afraid of this. And so it was just so clear to me that either you fit in with this group or you are their enemy. And I wanted to be in the arts. So what did I have to do at that point was fit in with the left, because at that point there was so much less opportunity for you being an artist and just kind of making your own way, and not being left leaning, because it was such a left-leaning industry. It's a little bit different now because there's more decentralization where you can just kind of do your thing and still have a career. But even still, like, you're still not part of the mainstream industry. The mainstream arts industry is still very ideologically homogenous, and they demonize people that don't toe the line. And so that kind of environment is super, super intense and unpleasant, especially if you're a young person who doesn't know what the hell you're doing and does not want to become a target of these people who seem really vicious. So it was like, okay, let me like really lean into being a Latina and go with this thing. Luckily, we had not started the Latinx thing yet. That was one of the straws where I was like, listen, I was down with some of the silly leftist stuff, like, oh, privilege and like whatever intersectionality thought, but do not call me Latinx. That even I, at that confused time in my life, was like, now we're just making stuff up. Now you guys are just making stuff up out of nowhere. What am I going to tell my grandma who only speaks Spanish? How do you even say Latinx in Spanish? That doesn't even translate. What are we doing here? So I remember being like, okay, now we've gone too far, even for me. And as someone that was like really just like, let me blend in. And so I was in this situation where so obvious to me that like this was the group I had to pander to. And so that's what I did. And I didn't have this kind of idea that like, oh, wow, wait a minute. The fact that this group mistreats and demonizes anybody that disagrees with it is evidence that it's an unhealthy group that I should not be trying to join. Like, forget it. I'll be alone. But the thing is, I didn't know who I was without a group. See? And so that comes back to that self-concept theory, or I'm sorry, social identity theory, by which your self-concept, who you think you are, comes from your group identity. So if you are that person who largely gets your sense of identity from groups, then you are really dependent on those groups, because without those groups, you don't know who you are. And so that was the situation that I had found myself in, because I had not developed values. I didn't know what the idea of principles was. I didn't know how to just be an individual and do my thing, because it felt like, well, you have to pick a lane. You have to be right wing or left wing. You have to put yourself into one of these groups if you want to get ahead, because a particularly political industry like the arts, they're not going to take kindly to you trying to just be yourself. Go figure. The irony is obvious. And you're going to have to play ball. And so that is what I did. So I remember creating art that was like, I am a Latinx. No, I never said Latinx. I'm a Latina and my abuela came from Cuba and da-da-da. And like, while some of it was good, like there was good parts in it, the reason I selected certain topics was because I knew that's what people wanted. And I think that's just such a nasty situation for an artist to find themselves in and to be doing, which at the time I didn't have this kind of awareness to be like, well, wait a minute, why are you selecting topics based on what other people want from you? That's the opposite of what art should be. You should be first fully grounded in the sense of like, this is what I want to see. This is what I want to create. This is meaningful to me. And then think of how you can make it meaningful to others too. That is a more aligned, like ethical even way to create art than what I was doing, which was like, okay, what do people want to hear? What do these people want to hear? Like, and this is part of the problem with like these group dynamics, which is they're so focused on whether you're in or out that there's this intense pressure to continually prove that you are in. And this is what I experienced when I was a leftist. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm a leftist and then I'm doing my thing. Like maybe it was back in the day before social media or whatever. Not always though, because of course there's plenty of periods throughout history where it wasn't just, oh, I'm a leftist and I'm doing my thing. It was like, you better be over here. You're going to get put up against the wall. And so let's not make light of that. But there was this sweet spot, you know, probably 70s, 80s, whatever, where you could just be a leftist and do your little thing. And it wasn't as intense as it is now, where people are so much more politically polarized and they're so much more likely to try to define you by your political ideology. And so there's this pressure to perform that political ideology, to continually show the group that you are part of the group. And you see this happen with so many things now, particularly online, because it really is this environment where like you have to post to be seen. And so if you want to show that like, oh no, I'm on your side, I have the right beliefs about this, I'm not like them, you have to constantly perform it. And so it's not enough to just like, oh, these are the beliefs I have, I'm doing other things in my life. No, you've got to show the group that you're constantly loyal to the group. And so this was the environment that I found myself in when I was younger on Tumblr, like kind of developing my political awareness and suddenly falling into this really intense conformist political group that was leftism. And I remember feeling like, okay, I have to show this group how much I fit in with their worldview. And so that's what I'm going to do with my art. That's what I'm going to do with my writing. And it was just it's such a misguided way, obviously, to go about your life, because why was I trying to please people that ultimately didn't actually care about who I really was, right? But that's the problem with these kind of groups that are primarily seeking obedient, conformist members. They don't really care about you. And that's the thing that it took me some time to realize was I'm here trying to avoid being attacked and trying to find favor with this group that doesn't actually care about what I have to say, doesn't actually care about my well-being as a person. All they care about is whether I promote their beliefs, whether I fit in with the group, whether I continue to toe the line no matter how many times the line is moved. This is what I realized later when I started to question the group that I was in, when I started to question these like increasingly extreme leftist ideas, particularly in 2020, when it was like you had this justifications of looting and like destruction of people's private property come out. And it was just like, okay, wait a minute. Like, wait a minute. Something is rotten in here, because now we've gotten to the point where we're actually encouraging people to ruin their lives because it shows how woke we are. Like, hey, look how leftist I am. I encourage people to burn down their own neighborhood. Yeah, I'm so anti-establishment, anti-capitalist, anti-racist that I encourage people to get killed by police burning down their local grocery store. This was the kind of shit that I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know where I'm going to fall after this, but somebody has to say something, and it's going to be me. And that was when I've really started to come to consciousness around like, wait, I can just do my thing. I don't actually have to toe some political line left or right. And then I started to develop my own individual belief system. And so a lot of this would have gone more quickly and perhaps more smoothly if I had these concepts like the black sheep effect, like social identity theory, like collectivism, like individualism. These were ideas that when I discovered them, suddenly so much made sense to me, because these dynamics that I felt like were perhaps just unique to my messy life, like, oh, it just seems like I'm the one that doesn't agree with everybody. Oh, there was such a terrible feeling to be like in that 2020 moment when it was like, something's wrong. Like, and a lot of people had not said anything yet. Like, it was such a different time. And it just felt like if you said, hey, I think anti-racism is actually kind of racist, ooh, that was it. You were going to be tarred and feathered in the virtual public square. And so there was so much fear around questioning these ideas because the black sheep effect was so strong at the time, because you had this group that had manufactured the illusion that everybody was in agreement, because so many people were too afraid to say, I don't agree with this. And so by virtue of everybody just not saying anything, you look around and you're like, I guess everybody agrees. I guess it's just me that's the weirdo that doesn't go along with this. And so that is like one of the most intense black sheep effects that I've ever seen, where it was like, if you if you questioned what was going on during like that 2020 moment, you knew that you were in for it. Like, man, you knew that there was going to be some backlash. It was crazy. And it was like such an intense moment also of like pressure to perform conformity, right? And like, this is like the another level too, because it wasn't only the black sheep effect in so much as, okay, if you question the dogma of the day, we're gonna insult you, bully you, try to get you fired, try to make your life miserable, because as opposed to you just being, right, like some openly always been a conservative, always been the enemy, which those people, like, yeah, they hated them, but it was like, we know we hate them. The black sheep effect is the people who are really going to get it from us, the people who we're going to go after them viciously, are the ones that are within our group, not conservatives, but who are questioning the dogma that we're pushing now. Those are the people that we're going to go after most, because those are the ones that are actually the most threatening to the illusion that everybody agrees. Because it's one thing to have conservatives saying like, hey, we don't like Black Lives Matter, because it's like, oh yeah, those racists, whatever. That doesn't really change the group's attempt to show, no, the good left-leaning people all agree that this D'Angelo Kendian style anti-racism is perfect morality and should be questioned. But if you, as a left-leaning, as a liberal, as a progressive person, said, well, wait a minute, this doesn't actually even go with my beliefs in treating people based on their character, not based on their skin color. This doesn't seem like it's actually even helping people. Wait a minute, when did opposing racism become destroying people's buildings? Like, what is going on here? Why is this devolving so quickly? If you were that person, that was the most dangerous kind of threat to the illusion of consensus, because now you had people who were within the group who were like, no, I am a liberal, I am a progressive, and I don't think this is right, I don't think this is good. And once you have those people, now that sense of the illusion of conformity, that everybody agrees that only bad right-wing conservatives would ever disagree, now that's broken. And you've seen what happened. Like, it's actually true. Like, that was a threat to the dogma, but good. Like, it was a necessary threat because the dogma was wrong. And so that's why the black sheep effect is so powerful and so important, because it is what allows a broken, unhealthy group to change, to be pushed away from power, because you have these people that are within the group and say, this isn't it. This isn't working. I think there's better ways. And so that was like the biggest takeaway for me, was that when I started to speak out at that time, when despite thinking like, I remember calling my therapist and being like, I think I'm going to get like canceled in a huge way. And I told him, I was like, I said that it's wrong to loot buildings and to like encourage people to damage their communities. And he was like, okay, yeah, we should prepare for some backlash to that. And actually there was not backlash, which was the amazing thing. Like, people were like, yes, wow, okay, finally, I've been waiting for someone to say this, but I didn't want to say it because I was afraid. And so, because I did that, because I decided I'm going to disagree with this group, even though I know that the consequences of it may be so high, I'm going to do it anyway. That black sheep moment is what has helped so many other people to say, this isn't what I mean when I say I want equality. This isn't what I mean when I say I'm against racism. And it's so, so important to have a society where you can do that, where you can question the dogma of a group and still move on with your life. Pear says, I worked on Melrose Ave in LA in 2020. So many small businesses were destroyed that were owned by Black people. It was madness. That is so crazy. I remember being on Melrose around 2020, I think, and seeing the places boarded up. And it was just like, what is going on? Why does this look like we're about to have a natural disaster? This is progress? This is compassion? This is going to help stop racism? How? Especially when you talk about the fact that like some of these businesses were owned by Black people and they had to board them up. And that's the kind of thing that we needed to be able to say, because the faster you can have that conversation where it's like, hey, wait a minute, like this isn't adding up, the faster we can undo or avoid the destruction of bad ideas being predominant and not being challenged. And so this is what I find super valuable about having the black sheep effect in my mind, because I realize, okay, the most important position you can find yourself in is that black sheep position, is that moment where you are in the minority of a group and you have a different view that needs to get said. And the fact that the group hates you for it is probably all the more reason why you need to say it. So let's talk about one last thing here, which is how to look for the black sheep effect in your life. So I think that this is a fun activity, because a lot of these psychological concepts can seem kind of grand and unrelated to everyday life. But I've found that once I understood the black sheep effect, it was just like I hit the ground running, looking for it and realizing, oh wow, this plays out in so many more places in our lives. And so for me, I've realized that not only am I the black sheep in my culture, in my society more widely, for holding like less popular political views and challenging like the predominant views that I believe are flawed, I'm the black sheep in my family. And what that means is that I'm usually the one that has a different way of doing things, has a different way of seeing things. And that's always been uncomfortable. Unlike some people who are black sheep, who are naturally predisposed to be disagreeable, to just be like, no, that's wrong, I don't see it like that, I think there's a totally different way to look at it. And they have no qualms about being the only person to say, you're all wrong. I am not that kind of black sheep. I am the kind of black sheep who's like, they're all wrong and I have to tell them, and it's going to be so uncomfortable and they're going to be mad at me and I'm going to feel weird and my face is going to get all red and I'm going to be so awkward. But they're wrong and I got to say something, because I can't just sit here and keep it all to myself, because I'm going crazy with how much I want to say this. So clearly it's something I need to say. That's the internal monologue for me as a black sheep. So hopefully that gives some of you a little bit of relatability, that if you are not that kind of a person that's like, oh, I have no problem challenging the whole group every day, all day, you are still potentially a black sheep if you find yourself in that position, even if you do not want to be in that position and find it uncomfortable. And so what I realized is that, okay, I really often am on a different page than people who I find myself around, whether it's some of my friends or some of my family or just like community as I'm going about my life. For whatever reason, I tend to think differently. I think part of it is because like once I learned to think based in principle and I stopped that like emotional, really just like I'm going to try to cling to my beliefs and justify them no matter what, just because those are my beliefs and I don't care what anybody says, I'm going to make sure they stay true. Like once I started to think instead like, okay, wait, I actually want to find what's true. I want to talk about what's accurate, and I want to bring about the things that don't make sense to me and say, that doesn't make sense to me. So let's find the gaps here. Once I started thinking and reasoning in that way, it put me at odds with a lot more people. And so I've realized that just like I did, I think a good many people still go about selecting and holding to their ideas primarily because it's comfortable or because it's simply the more popular idea held among a group that they like to be a part of. And so I think this is like hard for young people, for women who find themselves in social situations where everybody around you is like a super intense feminist, or everybody around you is a super intense social justice type of person, and you want to be friends with them, you want to get along, you're actually not this kind of person like, no, I want to debate, I want to get to the truth of the matter. Like, you just want to hang out and vibe. Like, you're not actually being driven to debate all these topics. And so what do? You start doing a bunch of research to figure out like, oh, what's true? Like, okay, wait a minute, that doesn't quite make sense. And No, you're probably just going to go along because you're in this situation. Most of your peers hold these views. And so that is a very natural process of acquiescing to the status quo for the sake of social cohesion. That is totally normal. And I think a lot of people do that. And I was one of those people. And so unless you are called into a different path where you become some kind of intellectual or an academic, or you get into this mode of thinking where it's like, no, actually, I don't actually care so much for social cohesion and going along to get along. I want to talk about the ideas and how they're true or not. Like, I actually want to have the accurate conversations and debates. If you end up in that mode, social cohesion suffers, because that is just the trade-off. Either you pursue social cohesion or you pursue truth. They're not going to lead you in the same direction every time. Oftentimes they're going to lead you in different directions, because polite society, vibes-based relationships where we're just kind of like, yeah, we all think the same. Yeah, we're hanging out thinking the same. I'm just going to kind of go with what you're saying. That kind of dynamic is not going to lead you to those discussions where it's like, okay, well, I don't think that's quite accurate because blah, 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 you know? So I think that's a very normal way for people to be. And so that's fine. More power to them. If you're, not everybody needs to be like some like grand truth seeker. I really don't think that we're even all built like that. That's why it's important that we do have people that are built like that and who do have the freedom to pursue that life, right? Because those are the people that can help us discover, okay, wait, so this is what is true. And then, it slowly filters down to the rest of the culture, hopefully. But not everybody has to be a rugged truth seeker. But the thing that I realized is that, okay, so I am doing that. I actually do want to get to what's true. I want to understand things. I want to have accurate beliefs. I care about making sense. I care about changing and adapting my worldview based on what brings me the most clarity and what seems to be most in harmony with reality. I don't care as much if that puts me at odds with other people. I don't care as much if that makes some people upset because they want to hold on to their beliefs and they don't like that I may challenge those. That's not my priority. And so the thing is, that's still really uncomfortable for me. I am not a person that finds it very easy or comfortable to challenge other people's beliefs, particularly when they're the kind of people that react negatively. They get tense, they get upset. Like, I really don't like that. And so it's not like I go looking for it, but at the same time, I value my integrity. And so if I find myself in a position where I'm around my whole family and everybody's like, haha, all those Trump voters, right? Aren't they all racist? I'm not going to go along with that. So I have to do the uncomfortable black sheep thing and say, no, I think some of them have legitimate reasons that have nothing to do with prejudice for why they voted. They may care about economics. They may care about foreign policy. They may care about government corruption. None of those things have to do with racism. And I think that, granted, since over half of the country voted for him, I think it's unlikely that over half of the country is made up of people who are primarily driven by racial hatred. I think our country would look a lot different if that was the case. And so I'm going to be the person that says that thing at the dinner table when everybody else is trying to have a vibes-based social cohesion first situation. And I'm not. And so it's a hard situation to find yourself in when you are in that like black sheep role where you're prioritizing something else and most of the people around you are not. And so that is a question of, what do you prioritize? What is most important to you? And what I've found is that being aware of this black sheep dynamic, by which people within a group actually have the most power to change a group by showing them that there are different ways to do things while still being part of this group. Those people really should live up to that role, as opposed to like diminishing themselves and biting their tongue and avoiding being the black sheep. Because when you're in that kind of a situation where you have the different take and no one else there is having that take, you introducing it can really expand people's minds and help them not to live in this echo chamber or develop a rigid worldview where they assume everybody thinks like them and the only people who don't think like them are those terrible people all the way out there. If you're the person right there that has that different take, you have an immense power to show them that that's not aligned with reality. There's different viewpoints here. And I think that that's such a responsibility and in some ways a duty that we can live up to as people who find ourselves in those positions where we're the odd one out, we're the black sheep. And it kind of changes the way you approach that situation then, because now instead of looking at it like, oh, once again, I am the odd one out, everybody is on this thought train and I don't agree and I feel like I'm just messing up the vibes party by being like, no, that's not how everybody thinks. Instead of having that kind of like sheepish, unpleasant energy around it, you can just like stand into your role as someone who is designed to break apart echo chambers, who is designed to hold groups accountable to whether they are going to be genuine communities where they value and respect individual variation within the group, or whether they have become unhealthy conformist collectives where they are primarily concerned with obedience and conformity and demonize members that don't go along just to get along. I think that is such a more powerful way to approach those kind of situations that I have a feeling a lot of people will inevitably find themselves in, particularly if you are a subscriber to the Black Sheep, where the whole idea of that publication is that we can find value through actually seeking out the people who are in the minority position, who are in the dissenting position. It's often those people who have some new, interesting take that the wider society or the larger group hasn't even arrived at yet, or not even prepared to contend with. And so if you look for the people who are like on the edges, who are in the minority of something, sometimes you can find things that are really valuable perspectives, because like that's usually where you find the entrepreneurs. That's usually where you find the artists. These are the people who are on the fringes, who are pushing the boundaries, who are like looking for things that are different. And so they're not in that like more homogenous group of people that are kind of just like, we're content with how things are. We're just upkeeping how things are. So rather than demonize the black sheep, demonizing these people that don't fit in with the group's norms, a healthy group and a healthy society intentionally looks to these people to see if they've figured out something that the group hasn't yet. If they are contending with some problem or some idea that is coming down the pipes but hasn't arrived to the wider group yet. And that is the wisdom of the black sheep effect. I'm going to look at some of the comments that we have here. Hello. Hey, Noah, thank you for joining. We got a lot of... Oh, yeah, I did want to talk about some of the people who I think meet the black sheep effect label. Tomi Lahren was fired from the Blaze for being pro-choice. Ooh, that's so interesting. I don't know a lot about her career, but that would be a perfect example of the black sheep effect, right? Which is like, she is a conservative for the most part. Like, she fits the normal definition of a conservative, but she has this one point of difference. Now, what is so interesting about this example of Tomi Lahren being fired from the Blaze for being pro-choice is that was the more popular position for the Republican Party to take in this previous election. That was a big issue for people. And Trump is on record saying, no, I will not do a national abortion ban. I'm going to leave it to the states. And I think that position was taken because it was seen as a more rational position for him to take. And it is the more popular position. I think that, there are a lot of people who are pro-life and conservative, but there are a lot more people who are concerned, like the Venn diagram of people who are more concerned about government overreach and corruption and like failed economic policies, and who are willing to just leave that be to personal choice within reason, is a larger group and is a more rational group than to court. So it's so interesting because what they did with Tomi was to fire her for being an outlier in the conservative group at that time. But actually, her position ultimately became more popular. And so that's the problem with that intolerance for in-group dissent, is that very often that dissent, it's not just some random person being like a thorn in the side of the group. It's someone who has already come to a conclusion that is going to become more popular. They are already dealing with some cultural issue or some idea or something that's going to be coming more into the mainstream. And so you might suppress that black sheep from your group, but the reality is you will still likely have to contend with what they were bringing up, because they were bringing it up not out of nowhere, but because they're more sensitive to what's actually going on in society or culture. They're more on the fringes looking for what's next, and less guided simply by being in line with the group. And so there you go. That is a great example of a black sheep. Someone else that I thought was a good example of a black sheep effect situation recently was Anna Kasparian, because I don't know all the details of her situation, but I believe she was on a podcast, and essentially she's criticized some of the progressive policies in I believe in California was where it was, that have led to like such an explosion of homelessness, but not just homelessness, but homeless people who are on drugs. And so like are often really just like doing this erratic behavior, which I remember experiencing myself when I was in California. And so what happened in her situation is that she criticized this otherwise like dogmatic belief held by leftists, which is don't say that policies for homelessness aren't working in California, and don't criticize that these people are a problem. Don't say that your safety matters more than letting homeless people just kind of like do whatever, which I don't know how that has ever become the supposedly compassionate left position, which is just don't do anything. That's our policy. Don't do anything or give them all houses. That's it. And if you say that in the meantime, the situation as it stands is dangerous and not good, you're a right-wing fascist. And that's essentially what happened to her, is that she got this huge backlash from her own group for stating the obvious, which is the left position on homelessness is bad. It is not working. You can look in California, in places like LA, and see that this approach to homelessness that the left is taking is not working. And she got a huge backlash for that. And it's interesting because you would have people on the right say this like all the time, but she got the backlash for saying it because she's not on the right. And so it's a perfect example of a group reserving more hostility for their own members who criticize the group than for out-group members who criticize the group. Why? Because what that in-group member criticizes is the thing that that group most wants to ignore. And when a group has their identity wrapped up in the group, like you are the group, that's how you get your identity. When someone criticizes the group, they're criticizing you. And so instead of having what we once had a lot more of as a culture, where people could divorce their identity from their political affiliation, and we treated people more as individuals, which is, okay, you're a conservative, you're a progressive, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, but what is your idea for this? What's your policy? And let's dissect the merits. Does that work? What's the precedent for this policy? What's the evidence that it should work? Instead of having that, where we just actually had the conversation, people's identities have become so tied up in their political affiliations that when someone like Anna Kasparian criticizes the left's approach to homelessness, they lash out at her with intense vitriol because it's like she's attacked the very people themselves and their core belief about themselves, rather than just saying, this policy isn't working, which is what she actually did. And so that's a perfect example of the black sheep effect. Oh, Tulsi Gabbard is another excellent example. Tulsi Gabbard, criticized by the Democratic Party, and their hostility over time pushed her out. Yeah, this is another example of someone that was within the group, the Democratic Party, but was not towing the line. Her primary goal as someone within that group wasn't stay within this group and always make this group look good. Her primary goal was actually pragmatic. It was, I want to do good things for my country. I want to do what I think is going to work. And so when that goal became at odds with the group's goal of simply, this is who we are, and we don't want any criticism because that would require us to reevaluate who we are, that causes conflict. And so then, instead of considering, okay, we have this Democrat, Tulsi Gabbard, who doesn't agree with the majority Democrat Party on some policies, let's figure out why. What is it that she sees that we don't? This would be the healthy, functional, intelligent way of utilizing black sheep thinkers, which is, okay, great. We have someone within our group that has a different perspective. Excellent. Let's see what we can learn from that. Of course, that is not what happens. Instead, it's, you're the problem. Actually, you were never part of our group. You're part of the enemy's group, and you need to get out of our group. You are a bigger enemy to us than the other people that are our actual opponents. And that's the black sheep effect. That's when you make a bigger enemy out of the people within your group who criticize it than the out-group members who criticize your group. Tulsi is a great example of the black sheep effect. Tulsi Gabbard was very anti-war, and she criticized their stance on trans issues. Yep, that'll do it. That'll do it. Let's see if we have any other points to cover on the black sheep effect before we wrap it up here. Thank you guys for joining this live stream. It's been really fun for me to recount my black sheep story because it feels like it's been 20 years since 2020. Somehow it feels like that happened so long ago. And I recounted, I'm just like, oh my gosh, what an awakening for so many of us, in such a weird way too. Very, very intense way to wake up and realize, okay, time to start questioning everything. And that's the thing about our groups, is that you really need that aspect of questioning. If you have a group that doesn't tolerate some level of dissent from its members, it's not a healthy group. And particularly you can see this when the conflict between in-group dissent, like between people within the same group who are disagreeing, isn't about the disagreement. It's about the people disagreeing. So if it becomes, the reason that these people who are within our group disagree with us is because they're evil, because they're malicious, because they're secret saboteurs, that is not a serious group. That is a highly conformist group, because that kind of behavior is simply meant to dismiss criticism by attacking the character of the critic. And so instead of contending with the criticism, you simply say, that person's evil. We don't need to deal with them. And that's largely what I saw happen to Anna Kasparian. She was criticizing the left's approach to homelessness after her own personal experience of being I think she said she was almost assaulted by a homeless person in LA, I believe. And this situation naturally led her to criticize what is going on with homelessness in cities like LA and saying, we're not dealing with this issue. Like, the position that the left has on this issue is simply not working, and we need to reevaluate it. And instead of contending with that criticism, they attacked her character. They attacked the validity of her claims that she had been assaulted, I believe is what the words that she's used. That she's just simply a secret right-winger trying to sabotage the left, that she's always just been a malicious person and hates homeless and is just a bigot. You know, you have this typical pattern of someone raises a criticism of a group, and that group, instead of dealing with the criticism of their own member, instead says, you were never a member. You're secretly an evil person who is just moonlighting as a member, and we dismiss you from our group. We don't have to deal with your criticisms. That is a group that is not interested in actually doing anything productive. Because if you're going to do productive things like solve problems, you look for the kind of criticism from your own members who say, this isn't working. I don't think this is a good idea. I mean, that's why businesses will send out customer surveys and constantly be like, tell us how we did. Tell us how we did. Because they know it is a fact that the best thing you can do to create a better process, to better achieve your goals, is to receive criticism from people who think you are failing at those processes to achieve your goals. And so when you have a group or a person who does not want to do that, they are not interested in genuinely pursuing their goals. They are more interested in merely maintaining the preservation of what they have at the time, whether that's the appearance of a successful group, or that is simply control, or that is simply the power to tell people, nope, you're no longer in the group because you've criticized us. But the one thing that they are not interested in is actually doing successful, tangible things to achieve a goal. Because if you do that, you need to take criticism from people who are within your group. And that is the beauty of the black sheep effect. It is like the canary in the coal mine for being able to understand, is a group actually healthy? Do they tolerate their black sheep? Or does this group respond to its black sheep with vitriol and censorship? Because if that's the case, it is not a healthy group. All right, y'all, I'm going to call it here. Thank you all for joining, and please make sure that you subscribe to the Black Sheep so that you stay updated on my next live stream. The next one we're going to do is the Good News Roundup, which has been so fun for me. As I've started to do this Good News Roundup, I realize how much we do not consume good news and how much we fixate on the negative news, likely because our negativity bias is running wild in a media landscape where we are constantly fed bad news. And so the Good News Roundup is a way to create some balance in your perspective. It's so healing. It has been for me. So make sure that you subscribe at wetheblacksheep.com so that you get updates on when I'm live streaming, so that you get the writing that we're publishing there, a lot of essays of people who have lived this black sheep experience where they've gone against a group and realized that this is what they needed to do because the group was unhealthy, and to live a healthy life, they needed to go outside of the group after challenging it and go their own way. And so you can find a lot of inspiration there for your own black sheep moments. And plus, you can find a black sheep community. We have a Discord server where a lot of black sheep minded people hang out and chat. And you can also just find people in the comments on the black sheep who like to have genuinely productive conversations, including disagreements, instead of just demonizing anyone who disagrees with them. So if that sounds like something you are interested in, go to wetheblacksheep.com and I will see you there.